Why is half of a country with 1.4 billion people practically empty? China is the most populous nation on Earth, but there's an invisible line that divides the country into two completely opposite worlds. East of this line live 94% of China's population. West of it, only 6%. We're talking about half the territory of a global superpower, larger than all of Western Europe, where almost no one lives. How is this possible? The answer begins in 1935, when a Chinese geographer named Hu Hanyang drew a diagonal line on the map from Heihei in the northeast to Tenkong in the southwest. He noticed something extraordinary. This line of approximately 2,400 kilometers divided China into two geographically equal halves, but demographically opposite ones. And 80 years later, this line remains exactly where it was. Nothing has changed. Not explosive economic growth, not mass migration, not forced government policies managed to alter this pattern. Why? Because the Hu Huanyang line isn't just a statistical curiosity. It's the direct result of brutal geography, extreme climate, and millennial history. Eastern China is fertile, rainy, and connected. Western China is desert, mountain, and void. But here's the paradox. This void isn't really empty. It's where China extracts its most valuable resources. It's where its most sensitive borders are located. And it's where the Chinese government is investing trillions to change a geographical reality that has remained stable for millennia. Is it possible to rewrite geography with money and political will? Or are there natural limits that no superpower can overcome? This isn't just an academic question. It's about understanding why one of the world's most powerful nations is fundamentally divided, and why that division might be permanent. How can an imaginary line control where billions of people live? The Hu Huanyang line starts in Heihei, a frozen city on the Russian border, and ends in Tenkong, a tropical city near Myanmar. Between these 2 points, it cuts diagonally through provinces, mountains, deserts, and plains. But this line isn't arbitrary. It's a direct reflection of Chinese physical geography. East of the line, you find the great alluvial plains of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. Flat, fertile lands that have been farmed for 5,000 years. Monsoon rains arrive reliably every summer, bringing 800 to 1,500 millimeters of precipitation annually. Rivers are navigable. Soils are rich. Growing seasons are long. This is where Chinese civilization was born, where rice paddies stretch to the horizon, where cities of 10 million people feel normal. West of the line, everything changes violently. The Tibetan Plateau rises 4,000 meters above sea level. The Gobi and Taklamakan deserts stretch endlessly, receiving less than 200 millimeters of rain per year. Mountains like the Tan, Shan, and Kunlun create walls that block moisture from reaching inland areas. Temperatures swing from 40 degrees Celsius in summer to minus 40 in winter. Growing crops is nearly impossible. Building infrastructure is extraordinarily expensive. And surviving requires constant adaptation. This isn't subtle difference, it's geographical brutality. The line marks where China's monsoon climate ends and continental aridity begins. Where rivers flow abundantly versus where they barely exist, where agriculture flourishes versus where it fails, and most importantly, where people can easily live versus where survival is struggle. For 5,000 years, Chinese civilization expanded eastward toward the coast and stopped westward at this line. Not because of lack of ambition, but because geography said no. Why does rainfall control human destiny? Water is everything. And the Hu Huanyang line marks exactly where reliable water ends in China. Eastern China receives moisture from the Pacific monsoon. Every summer, warm, humid air sweeps inland from the ocean, bringing life-giving rain to hundreds of millions of people. This predictable water cycle enabled agriculture, which enabled cities, which enabled civilization. But monsoons weaken as they move inland. By the time air masses reach Western China, they've already dropped most of their moisture. And then geography delivers the final blow, the Tibetan Plateau. At an average elevation of 4,500 meters, it's called the roof of the world for good reason. It blocks what little moisture remains from reaching the interior. The result? Eastern China is green. Western China is brown. You can see this division from space. Satellite images show dense agricultural patchwork east of the line and vast stretches of bare rock and sand west of it. This isn't temporary. It's structural reality written into Earth's climate system. But water scarcity does more than prevent farming. It prevents everything. Cities need water for drinking, sanitation, industry. Transportation requires rivers or expensive alternatives. People need food, which requires agriculture or long supply chains. In eastern China, all of this is natural. In western China, all of this is engineered and expensive. Here's the scale. Beijing, near the line's eastern end, receives about 600 millimeters of rain annually. Urumqi, deep in the west, receives 280 millimeters. That difference sounds small, but it's the difference between civilization and emptiness. Because agriculture needs consistent rain, and humans cluster where food grows easily. For millennia, Chinese farmers understood this instinctively. They settled where rice grew. They avoided where it didn't, and they created a population distribution that would remain frozen for thousands of years. How did ancient emperors try to conquer the unconquerable? The empty West wasn't always ignored. Chinese dynasties repeatedly attempted to populate and control these regions. The Han Dynasty sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to garrison the Silk Road. The Tang Dynasty established military colonies across Central Asia. The Qing Dynasty conquered Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia, tripling China's size. But conquest isn't settlement. Soldiers can occupy territory temporarily. Civilians need reasons to stay permanently, and Western China offered few reasons. The logistics were nightmarish. Every grain of rice, every tool, every piece of clothing had to be transported hundreds or thousands of kilometers across mountains and deserts. Garrison towns survived on subsidies from eastern China, not local productivity. When dynasties weakened, these outposts collapsed immediately. Why? Because they were fighting geography, not just enemies. The Qing Dynasty understood this problem clearly. In the 18th century, they tried systematic colonization of Xinjiang. They offered land grants, tax exemptions, and transportation subsidies to Han Chinese farmers willing to migrate west. Thousands went, most came back or died. The ones who stayed clustered in a few oasis towns where irrigation was possible. The vast spaces between remained empty. Even the Chinese Communist Party, with vastly more resources and authority, faced the same reality. In the 1950s and 60s, they forcibly relocated millions of people westward in campaigns to open up the West. They built state farms, mining towns, and industrial centers in impossible locations. Some survived through continuous government subsidy. Many failed completely. And the overall population distribution barely changed. Because you can't subsidize geography forever. Eventually, economics reasserts itself. People migrate to where opportunity exists naturally, not where government wishes it existed. And opportunity follows water, which follows rainfall, which stops at the Huhanyang line. Why does the Chinese government obsess over an empty desert? Because that empty land contains everything modern China needs. Rare earth minerals essential for smartphones and military technology. Vast coal and natural gas reserves. Strategic depth against hostile neighbors. And most importantly, water. Western China might be dry, but it's where China's rivers begin. The Tibetan Plateau is the source of the Yellow, Yangtze, and Mekong rivers. Control the plateau, control the water. Control the water, control everything downstream. This gives the empty West enormous strategic value despite its emptiness. Xinjiang contains China's largest oil and gas fields. Tibet's glaciers feed rivers that 2 billion people depend on. Inner Mongolia has the world's largest rare earth deposits. And the entire western region serves as a buffer zone between China, populated east, and potentially hostile neighbors: Russia, Central Asian states, India, Pakistan. But here's the problem. How do you control territory where your own people don't live? China's solution has been systematic, expensive, and controversial. First, infrastructure. The Chinese government has spent hundreds of billions building highways, railways, and airports across the West. The Qinghai-Tibet Railway, completed in 2006, is an engineering marvel reaching altitudes where passengers need supplemental oxygen. High-speed rail lines now connect Western cities to the prosperous coast. Second, economic incentives. The Western Development Strategy, launched in 2000, pours investment into the region. Cities like Chengdu and Chongqing near the line have become tech hubs. Resource extraction creates jobs, though not many. Third, and most controversially, population management. The government has encouraged Han Chinese migration westward while simultaneously controlling Uyghur, Tibetan, and Mongolian populations through policies that international observers call cultural suppression. The goal is clear: make the West Chinese not just legally, but demographically. Replace emptiness with controlled population. But even with unlimited resources, progress is slow. How much money does it take to fight geography? The answer is trillions with limited success. China's Western development strategy has invested over $500 billion since 2000, with plans for trillions more. They've built cities that barely anyone lives in, highways that carry little traffic, airports serving empty regions. Why? Because the Chinese Communist Party believes infrastructure creates development, not the reverse. The theory is logical. Build it and they will come. But Western China is proving this theory has limits. Consider Kangbashi, a district of Ordos in Inner Mongolia. Why are China's emptiest regions also its most politically sensitive? Because the West isn't actually empty of people. It's empty of Han Chinese. Tibet is home to 3.6 million Tibetans. Xinjiang has 12 million Uyghurs. Inner Mongolia has several million Mongols. These populations aren't tiny. They're just overwhelmed by the scale of the land they inhabit and outnumbered by Han Chinese that government policy has encouraged to migrate westward. And this creates China's most persistent political challenge. How do you integrate regions that are culturally, linguistically, and religiously different from the Han heartland? Regions that were conquered relatively recently? Regions where local populations often resist integration? China's answer has been increasingly controversial. In Xinjiang, the government has built what it calls vocational education centers that international observers call detention camps, holding potentially over 1 million Uyghurs. It justifies this with security concerns about terrorism and separatism, concerns that have some factual basis, but that critics argue don't justify mass detention. In Tibet, the government restricts religious practice, monitors Buddhist monasteries, and controls who can be recognized as religious leaders. It argues this prevents separatism. Critics call it cultural genocide. In Inner Mongolia, the government recently mandated that schools teach in Mandarin rather than Mongolian, provoking rare public protests. The pattern is clear. Beijing views ethnic and religious distinctiveness in border regions as security threats. And empty geography makes this problem worse, not better. When populations are sparse and spread across vast distances, governments have two choices: leave them autonomous or control them intensely. China has chosen intense control. But this creates a vicious cycle. Harsh policies increase resentment. Resentment increases security concerns. Security concerns justify harsher policies. And international criticism creates a siege mentality where China views any discussion of its western regions as foreign interference designed to weaken the nation. Could climate change finally break the Hu-Huanyang line? This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Climate scientists predict that global warming will shift rainfall patterns across Asia. Some models suggest northwestern China could receive significantly more precipitation as weather systems change. Glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau are melting, initially increasing river flow before eventually reducing it. And desertification is accelerating in some areas while vegetation is expanding in others due to both climate change and government reforestation programs. If the West becomes wetter, could it become livable? Could climate change succeed where emperors and communist planners failed? The answer is complicated. Yes, some areas are seeing modest increases in rainfall and vegetation. China's Great Green Wall project has planted billions of trees to stop desert expansion, with mixed results. Some degraded grasslands are recovering. Some desert edges are greening, but the fundamental geography remains unchanged. The Tibetan Plateau isn't descending. The monsoon pattern isn't reversing. Even with increased precipitation, Western China will remain drastically drier than the East for centuries. We're talking about going from 200 millimeters to perhaps 300 millimeters of annual rainfall in some locations. That's still desert, just slightly less extreme desert. More concerning is water scarcity in the East. Climate change threatens the very regions that make the Hu-Huanyang line's eastern side livable. Northern China is experiencing severe water stress. The Yellow River sometimes runs dry before reaching the ocean. Aquifers are depleting. and hundreds of millions of people need more water, not less. China's solution? Redirect water from the south to the north through the South-North Water Transfer Project, one of history's largest engineering projects. 3 massive canal systems now pump water over 1,000 kilometers northward. But this treats symptoms, not causes. It doesn't make the West habitable. It keeps the East survivable. Why does understanding China's empty half matter to the entire world? Because China's geography directly affects global politics, economics, and security. First, resources. As the West gets harder to populate, it gets more valuable to exploit. Rare earths from Inner Mongolia power global technology. Xinjiang's cotton, despite controversy over forced labor allegations, supplies worldwide textile chains. Tibet's water affects nearly half of Asia's population. Second, geopolitics. China's western regions border 14 different countries. These empty spaces buffer China from Russia, India, and Central Asia. They host military bases, nuclear testing sites, and strategic early warning systems. Control of Tibet gives China leverage over India. Control of Xinjiang opens Central Asian trade routes, crucial for the Belt and Road Initiative. Third, stability. The Chinese government believes that failure to control the West means national fragmentation. They remember how European colonial powers and later the Soviets tried to detach peripheral regions. They see what happened to the USSR when ethnic republics broke away. This shapes their aggressive policies in places like Xinjiang, which they justify internally as existential defense. Fourth, migration. If climate change makes northern China less habitable, where do hundreds of millions of people go? Not west, where geography still constrains development. South into Southeast Asia? East toward coastal megacities that are already crowded? This potential crisis could destabilize the entire region. And finally, there's the question of limits. If China, with its authoritarian efficiency, unlimited resources, and determination, cannot overcome the Huhuanyang line after decades of trying, what does this tell us about human power versus natural constraints? It suggests that geography still matters fundamentally, that some limits can't be engineered away, that nature imposes boundaries even on superpowers. This is humbling and important to remember. So we return to the original question, why is half of China empty? Because geography is destiny, even in the 21st century. The Huhuanyang line isn't a failure of development or lack of trying. It's recognition of fundamental reality. Humans cluster where survival is easy and prosperity is possible. Eastern China offers both. Western China offers neither, despite massive investment. This doesn't mean the line will never shift. Climate change, technology, and economics could gradually alter population distribution. China's western cities are growing, just much slower than eastern ones. Resources will continue flowing from the empty west to the crowded east, making the void economically valuable, even if demographically empty. But dramatic change is unlikely. You can't trick geography. You can't subsidize an entire desert into productivity. You can build infrastructure, but you can't force people to stay where opportunity is absent. The Huhuanyang line has lasted almost 90 years not because of policy, but despite policy. It will likely last 90 more. What makes this story fascinating is what it reveals about modern China. Here's a nation that has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, built more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined, and become a technological superpower. Yet it cannot overcome a geographical constraint identified by one geographer with a pencil in 1935. This is both humbling and illuminating. It reminds us that for all our technology and ambition, we still inhabit a physical planet with physical limits. That where we live is still determined largely by where water falls from the sky. And that some lines, even invisible ones, are more powerful than governments. The massive empty zone inside China will likely remain massive and empty. Not because China is weak, but because the Earth is stronger. And sometimes the most powerful lesson is learning what cannot be changed.